Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and once again you're listening to the voice of the American Dissident, and I'm your host, Jeffrey Whittla. I was talking to a friend of mine on here a couple of nights ago, and I was asking her to comment on what she thought of my show, and she gave her unbiased opinion, and she told me that it was a little dry and that I needed to liven things up a little bit. Well, it's not my mission to entertain people. If you want to be entertained, watch television, go to the movies. The situation that our nation faces is very precarious. It's a very serious situation. A couple of my broadcasts have been dedicated to exposing the real reasons why our politicians want to disarm us. And little is ever mentioned from those in the truth broadcast movement, or the truth movement, excuse me, as to what organizations these people belong to and what their goals really are. And as I've stated before, it's very essential that people understand the aims and purposes and functions of an organization known as the Council on Foreign Relations. I would be willing to bet that not 1 in 10,000 Americans even knows that this organization even exists. And today, in my studies and surfing of the internet, I came across a book which I have in my home library, which I haven't thought about for a long time, and I feel that it's very essential to relay the information contained in it to my listeners. This book is a historical book, and it's very important that the American people go back through history to understand where we've been and where they intend to take us. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring this website up, and I had found it on Scribd, and I actually have downloaded it to my computer, but I believe that we can get it to work here tonight, as I believe I've solved a lot of my computer problems. The title of the book is The Council on Foreign Relations, America's Unelected Rulers. And if you excuse me, I'm going to turn my volume down here a little bit, as I believe it's a little too high, and we will get it back to where it belongs. And as I said, the book is entitled The Council on Foreign Relations, America's Unelected Rulers, by Kent and Phoebe Courtney, and all information contained therein and credit and information for this broadcast tonight is due to the authors. And I'm going to skip down right here, and I believe that this is all self-explanatory, ladies and gentlemen. They lay out the aims of the Council on Foreign Relations. The Council on Foreign Relations, who Dianne Feinstein, one of the most rabid anti-Second Amendment senators, is a member of. And they state quite factually that the CFR's plan is to destroy America's national sovereignty, subvert the U.S. Constitution via NATO and the Atlantic Community, and put the U.S. under control of a socialist-dominated world government, ladies and gentlemen, and the emphasis is mine. And I'm going to go down, and we're going to skip all the mundane parts of this book in the beginnings, and I am going to go past the acknowledgments, past the table of contents, and we're going to get through as much of this book tonight, ladies and gentlemen, as we can, because I believe it's very important that my broadcast documents everything that I say. And I'm going to keep scrolling down till we can get to where we need to be. And we are going to start. On October 18, 1961, the News and Courier of Charleston, South Carolina stated in an editorial, "To understand the United States today, it is necessary to know something about the establishment." And here's something I want to emphasize, ladies and gentlemen. Most citizens don't realize it exists, yet the establishment makes its influence felt from the President's cabinet to the professional life of a young college teacher who wants to obtain a foundation grant for research. It affects the nation's policies in almost every area. The establishment is a general term for those people in finance, business, and the professions, largely from the Northeast, who hold the principal measure of power and influence in this country, irrespective of what administration occupies the White House. The syndicated columnist Edith Kermit Roosevelt described the policies of the establishment as follows. What is the establishment's viewpoint? Through Roosevelt, Truman, Eisenhower, and Kennedy administrations, its ideology is constant, that the best way to fight communism is by a one-world socialist state governed by quote-unquote experts like themselves. The result has been policies which favor the growth of the superstate, gradual surrender of U.S. sovereignty to the United Nations, and a steady retreat in the face of communist aggression. On February 23, 1954, Senator William Jenner stated, "Today the path to total dictatorship in the United States can be laid by strictly legal means, unseen and unheard by the Congress, the President, or the people. Outwardly, we have a constitutional government. We have operating within our government, ladies and gentlemen, and political system, another body representing another form of government. A bureaucratic elite which believes our Constitution is outmoded and it is sure that it is on the winning side." And that includes people like Senator Dianne Feinstein, ladies and gentlemen, Senator Charles Schumer, Senator John McCain, former Senator Chuck Hagel, the new Secretary of State John Kerry. Whether they have an R or a D behind their name, their goals and their aims are always the same. All the strange developments in foreign policy agreements may be traced to this group who are going to make us over to suit their pleasure. We must consider our danger not only in the terms of the treaties or agreements which have been completed, but in terms of those still in the pipelines, or already in effect, but still invisible to Congress or to the people. This political action group has its own local political support organizations, its own pressure groups, its own vested interests, its foothold within our government, and its own propaganda apparatus. Someone somewhere conceived the brilliant strategy of revolution by the assembly line. The pattern for total revolution was divided into separate parts, each of them as innocent, safe, and familiar looking as possible. The men who made the blueprints know exactly what the final product is to be. They have planned the final assembly years ahead. And ladies and gentlemen, the final assembly of their plan is going on right now in the year 2013 as we speak. President Barack Hussein Obama has asked members of our military whether or not they will fire on American citizens. He is in the process of weeding out all patriotic Americans serving within our military. The Department of Homeland Security has ordered and possesses 1.3 billion rounds of ammunition. Urban warfare combat training has recently been conducted in at least 2 cities that I know of, Houston and Miami, and word is that it's going on in other cities as we speak tonight. they know that a vast majority of American gun owners will not turn in their firearms. And they surely did not order 1.3 billion rounds of ammunition purely for training purposes. And we are going to continue with our discussion of this book and study of this material. Garrett, in his book The Revolution Was, published in 1944, referred to the establishment as, quote-unquote, the revolutionary elite. Mr. Garrett listed the aims of the revolutionary elite as follows. A. To ramify the authority and power of executive government, its power, that is, to rule by decrees and rules and regulations of its own making. President Barack Hussein Obama, ladies and gentlemen, has issued countless and countless executive orders dealing with such a statement as made in this book 40 years ago. It's pretty prophetic how some of these authors really are, isn't it, ladies and gentlemen? B. To strengthen its hold upon the economic life of the nation. C. To extend its power over the individual, and that is rapidly happening as we speak, with the command and control systems that are being developed and are already in place, facial recognition technologies, X-ray scanners, and a whole host of other new technologies being made available to law enforcement agencies. E. To impair the great American tradition of an independent constitutional judicial power. F. To weaken all other powers, the power of private enterprise, the power of private finance, the power of state and local government. G. To exalt the leader principle. In an article appearing in the May 1962 issue of Esquire, entitled The American Establishment, Richard H. Rovere states, "It is interesting to observe the workings of the establishment in presidential politics. As I have pointed out, it rarely fails to get one of its members or at least one of its allies into the White House. In fact, it generally is able to see to it that both nominees are men acceptable to it." Mr. Rovere was apparently echoing a similar statement made by Senator William E. Jenner in February 1956 when Jenner stated, "Every president since 1933 has been the captive of the governmental elite. The domestic policy of the establishment is the ultimate socialization of the United States, with its resultant destruction of the U.S. Constitution and its guarantees of individual liberty and freedom." High in the ranks of establishment members is Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., former professor of history at Harvard University, now a special assistant to President John F. Kennedy. And see, ladies and gentlemen, that's why I go back into history, because history links itself to our present situation. In a periodical entitled Partisan Review, dated May-June 1947, there appears an article by Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr. in describing the Partisan Review. Congressman John Russellout of California stated that it, quote, is actually read only by professional intellectual socialists of all shades, from the out-and-out pro-communist to the Fabian Keynesian socialist. It is almost unknown outside the professional leftist group. They use it to inform each other of their plans and projects, unquote. Congressman Russellout then inserted into the congressional record, which I have published, which is available on the internet, of September 26, 1961, an article written in 1947 by Schlesinger, which Mr. Russellout termed, quote, a blueprint of the plan for turning the people of the United States over to a monolithic socialist, fascist, Marxist type of tyranny, unquote. Below are only a few excerpts from the Schlesinger article of 1947, which clearly reflect the thinking of the man who today holds the position of special advisor to President Kennedy. Socialism appears quite practicable as a long-term proposition. Its gradual advance might well preserve order and law, keep enough internal checks and discontinuities to guarantee a measure of freedom, and evolve new and real forms for the expression of democracy. The active agents in effecting the transition will probably be not the working class, but some combination of lawyers, business and labor managers, politicians, and intellectuals, in the manner of the First New Deal or the Labour government in Britain. Discussing how the socialists intend to take over the United States, Schlesinger in the same article stated, "If socialism, i.e. the ownership by the state of all significant means of production, is to preserve democracy, it must be brought about step by step, in a way which will not disrupt the fabric of custom law and mutual confidence. That is, the transition must be piecemeal, it must be parliamentary, it must respect civil liberties and due process of law. Socialism by such means used to seem fantastic to the hard-eyed melodramatists of the Leninist persuasion, but even Stalin is reported to have told Harold Lasky recently that it might be possible." Ladies and gentlemen, what was the result of the TARP bailouts of the year 2008 in the financial collapse? The federal government illegally took over the auto industry, segments of the banking industry, and again, words written 40 years ago are most prophetic. The things written down 40 years ago, ladies and gentlemen, as a warning to the American people, are happening today as we speak. And we will continue with our book and our discussion. Mr. Schlesinger's concern regarding legalities is ominously reminiscent of Hitler's regard for legalities as he took over Germany in the 1930s. In this connection, it is also noteworthy that the 1961 edition of Webster's New Collegiate Dictionary defines Hitler's National Socialism as, quote, "the body of political and economic doctrines held and put in effect by the National Socialist German Workers' Party in the Third German Reich, including the totalitarian principle of government and state control of all industry," unquote. The purpose of this book: 1. What fronts are used by the establishment to carry out its goals of turning the United States into a socialist state and subjecting the United States to the control of a socialist world order? 2. Who are the individuals carrying out the establishment's programs? 3. Who finances the activities of the establishment? 4. How have members of the establishment infiltrated key policy positions of the U.S. government? The purpose of this book is to give documented answers to the above questions. In addition, we will show the giant interlock between A, the foreign aid program, B, the foreign trade program, C, the common market program, D, organizations promoting various stages of world government under which the U.S. would lose its national sovereignty. All of the establishment's anti-American plans, proposals, and programs can be defeated if the American people are informed and aware of this threat to the survival of this nation as a constitutional republic. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the goal of this broadcast, The American Dissident, and the goal of other broadcasters. That is why, as I've stated, everything that I talk about in this broadcast is documented fully. And this is a dire warning to the people of America. It is time that you wake up. The most prominent and most powerful of the organizations composing the establishment is the Council on Foreign Relations. As I said, Dianne Feinstein is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. According to the Dan Smoot report of July 17, 1961, the Council on Foreign Relations is the invisible government of the United States by virtue of the fact that members of the Council occupy key posts in the executive branch of government from the presidency downward. By its own efforts and through many interlocking organizations, the Council on Foreign Relations also virtually controls public opinion in the United States. Richard H. Rovere, writing in the May 1962 issue of Esquire, corroborates Mr. Smoot's statement as follows. The directors of the Council on Foreign Relations make up a sort of presidium for the part of the establishment that guides our destiny as a nation. So dominant has become the influence of the Council on Foreign Relations that it has almost taken over the prescribed activities of the U.S. State Department. By managing to place its members in key positions in the State Department, the CFR has in essence become a super-governing hierarchy, not subject to the control of Congress or the American people. What are the views being advocated by the Council on Foreign Relations, which experts such as a Machiavellian influence of the policies of the government of the United States? The establishment's foreign policy recommendations. 1959, ladies and gentlemen, the Committee on Foreign Relations of the United States Senate commissioned a series of foreign policy studies to be prepared by so-called foreign policy research centers throughout the country. These foreign policy recommendations totaled 1,431 fine print pages. The Foreign Policy Clearinghouse, a nonpartisan private organization, made a summary of these foreign policy recommendations, which were published by Frederick A. Prager Incorporated under the title of Strategy for the 1960s. The book carries the imprimatur of Senator J.W. Fulbright, chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and apparently Senate spokesman for the Council on Foreign Relations. Senator Fulbright, it will be recalled, gained notoriety in 1961 because of his semi-secret document, the so-called Fulbright Memorandum, which urged the muzzling of the military who warned of the communist threat. An indication of the views of the CFR's Fulbright is the following statement, which was contained in the Fulbright Memorandum. In the long run, it is quite possible that the principal problem of leadership will be, if it is not already, to restrain the desire of the American people to hit the communists with everything we've got, particularly if there are no more Cubas and Laoses. Pride in victory and frustration and restraint during the Korean War led to MacArthur's revolt and McCarthyism. In the internationalism promoting book Strategy for the 1960s are found a number of foreign policy recommendations, some of which are already in effect, some soon to be carried out, with Council on Foreign Relations members or aides in the State Department quietly working on final details for the all-out thrust of the United States government into a socialist, one-world order. Page 91 of Strategy for the 1960s is entitled Study Number 7, Basic Aims of U.S. Foreign Policy. This study was published by the Council on Foreign Relations November the 25th, 1959. Following are excerpts from the CFR recommendations to the U.S. Senate, the CFR's views on foreign policy. Foreign Relations Committee as summarized in Strategy for the 1960s together with our comments. Resisting Communist Expansion. States the Council on Foreign Relations study. The U.S. has largely been successful in resisting communist expansion. The inaccuracy of the above statement is incredible. It follows the Orwellian brainwashing technique of black as white, peace is war, slavery is freedom, etc. Further, the foregoing statement clearly shows the contempt in which members of the establishment hold the intelligence of the American people. Today, thanks to the efforts of the growing anti-communist movement within the United States, the showing of such films as Operation Abolition, Communism on the Map, and Communist Encirclement, 1961, to thousands of groups throughout the country, many high school students are apparently more aware of the extent of communist aggression than are the so-called foreign policy experts of the Council on Foreign Relations. The truth of the matter is, however, that the CFR is well aware of communist gains since 1945. The only reason for their totally erroneous statement regarding successfully resisting communist expansion is to attempt to hide the true facts from the American people. Ladies and gentlemen, there are two books, and I hope that you have a pen and paper and write these down. New Lies for Old and the Perestroika Deception. It is a common conception and thought in the United States that the collapse of the Berlin Wall and the demise of the Soviet Union were real events, and that communism no longer is our enemy. Nothing can be further from the truth, ladies and gentlemen. Communism changed its name, and former KGB agent Anatoly Golitsyn is the author of both of these books. And while you're at it, get the book Perestroika, written by Mikhail Gorbachev, in which he states and admits quite freely that the collapse of the Soviet Union was a ruse to lull the West to sleep. It's very essential that the American people are aware of these dangers, because communism and socialism, ladies and gentlemen, are cut from the same political block of timber. They are both on the left. Whether or not Adolf Hitler fought Joseph Stalin in World War II makes no difference. They were not fighting an ideology. They were fighting, in a sense, essentially a race war. Adolf Hitler's war in World War II wasn't a war against communism. It was a war to expand the borders and influences of the German Reich. And we will continue with the book. In further refutation of the statement in the CFR study number 7, consider the fact that at the time of the signing of the United Nations Charter in 1945, during the Truman administration, 200 million people were behind the Iron Curtain. Today, 17 years later, under both Democrat and Republican administrations, more than 900 million people have been taken over by the Soviet Union. When the Eisenhower administration took office in 1953, the following nations were controlled by the Soviet Union: Albania, Bulgaria, Red China, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, North Korea, Outer Mongolia, Poland, Romania, and Yugoslavia. By 1961, the following additional nations had been completely taken over but are now ruled by Soviet-directed dictators: Cuba, Hungary, North Vietnam, and Tibet. Further, either by way of communist sympathizers who run the government or highly successful communist agitation, the communists have acquired almost complete control in the following countries: Afghanistan, British Guyana, Cambodia, the Congo, Egypt, Ghana, Guinea, Iceland, Indonesia, Iraq, Laos, South Korea, Syria, Tunisia, Venezuela, and Yemen. Isn't it quite funny, ladies and gentlemen? Isn't it quite funny that most of the strife and conflicts you're seeing today in 2013 of recent are occurring in most of these countries that are listed in this book some 40 years ago? The Council on Foreign Relations study number 7 complains that the U.S. policy is deficient in long-range planning. They blame this deficiency on the U.S. Constitution division of foreign policy responsibility between the executive and legislative branches of government, and the resultant tendency to tie policies and programs to the Procrustean flexibility of the fiscal year. For the benefit of those readers who may not have a dictionary handy, and may not be or wish to be too familiar with eggheadese, we have just consulted Webster's New Collegiate Dictionary and find that the word Procrustean means harsh or inflexible in fitting someone or something to a preconceived idea, system, etc. The CFR study is correct in its use of the word Procrustean in describing the U.S. Constitution. The U.S. Constitution was intended to be inflexible in preserving the individual rights of the citizens of this nation. The divinely inspired Constitution of the United States of America was conceived and ratified by men who had long suffered under tyranny. The purpose of the Constitution was to protect the people from tyrannical practices and policies of their own government. In the famous preamble to our Constitution, quote, "We the people of the United States," unquote, proclaim to the world that our government belongs to the people and is run by the people. Article 1, Section 1 of the Constitution contains possibly its most restrictive sentence, which is as follows. All legislative powers herein shall be vested in a Congress of the United States, which shall consist of a Senate and House of Representatives. Note the use of the word all. It is this portion of the Constitution the CFR's views on It is this portion of the Constitution which is hampering the efforts of the internationalists in the State Department to take over legislative processes in order to implement their programs and concentrate all power in the executive branch. Such a political philosophy is contrary to the spirit and wording of the United States Constitution. Beginning with Article 1, Section 8, Clause 1, and ending with the final clause in Article 1, the Constitution devotes itself to outlining the powers and functions of Congress, beginning with the phrase, quote, "The Congress shall have power to," unquote. In order to prevent a power grab by the executive department headed by the President, the framers of the Constitution laid out and clearly defined in Article 2 the limited power of the executive branch. Tyrannical dictatorship can never fasten itself upon the United States as long as the U.S. Constitution stands intact. That is why those who would subvert our Constitution complain, as the CFR study puts it, about the Constitution's division of foreign policy responsibility between the executive and legislative branches of government. Building a new international order. Under the section entitled The Foreign Policy Tasks Which Lie Ahead, the Council on Foreign Relations Study Number 7 lists as the first task, Building a New International Order. The CFR Study Number 7 then states that freedom of nations is recognized as interdependent, and adds that such a new international order should also include states labeling, quote, labeling themselves as socialists, unquote. In all international organizations to which the United States presently belongs, such as the United Nations and NATO, the United States has only one vote. The CFR's proposal to build a new international order would therefore place the United States in an international world government with socialist states, which would, of course, outnumber the United States. Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. Thus, governmental policy of the United States would be determined by socialist nations overseas. The second and third points which the Council on Foreign Relations Study recommends are safeguard U.S. securities through regional arrangements, maintain and gradually increase the authority of the United Nations. And I've documented this, ladies and gentlemen, on other broadcasts. And that is exactly one of their goals, is to progressively strengthen the United Nations where it cannot be challenged. The American people have been deliberately deceived regarding those so-called regional arrangements. For example, we are told that NATO is a shield against communist aggression. This, however, is refuted by the fact that although NATO is supposed to be a regional organization composed of free world nations opposed to communism, NATO is actually under the control of the Soviet-dominated United Nations. Article 53 of the UN Charter states that no regional organization can take any enforcement action as a deterrent against aggression without the authorization of the UN Security Council. Article 54 of the UN Charter states that the UN Security Council, quote, shall at all times be fully informed of activities undertaken by regional agencies such as NATO. The Soviet Union, a member of the all-powerful Security Council, exercises veto power. The simple question then arises, how could it be possible to, quote, safeguard U.S. security, unquote, through regional arrangements such as the CFR study proposes, when the regional arrangements themselves are under the domination of the only force that threatens American security, namely the Soviet Union? Regional arrangements such as NATO and also United States involvement in the United Nations will be discussed later. U.S. Underworld Court. Point 4 of the Council on Foreign Relations Study Number 7 is, make more effective use of the International Court of Justice, jurisdiction of which should be increased by withdrawal of reservations by member nations on matters judged to be domestic. What this seemingly innocuous proposal urges is the repeal of the Connolly Amendment, which states that the International Court of Justice, or World Court, shall not have jurisdiction in matters which are essentially within the domestic jurisdiction of the United States as determined by the United States. What is the World Court? All World Court judges are nominated by governments which are members of the United Nations. There are no uniform United Nations qualifications for World Court judges. Not even a legal degree is required. The World Court is composed of 15 judges. No nation may have more than one judge. Thus, the United States is outnumbered 14-1 on the World Court, with the court being composed of a representative of the Soviet Union plus one or more judges from Soviet satellite nations. 9 of these 15 judges make up a quorum. In the majority of a quorum, only 5 is enough for a decision from which there is no appeal. If the Connolly Reservation is repealed, as the Council on Foreign Relations Study number 7 urges, it would be possible for the Soviet Union or one of its satellites and judges from 3 Soviet Union countries to get together, form a quorum, and render judgments affecting domestic issues in the United States. In April 1961, a Polish communist by the name of Bohdan Stefan Winarowski was elected president of the UN's International Court of Justice by his fellow UN judges, including the U.S. Representative Philip C. Jessup, member of the Council on Foreign Relations. The term of office for this communist president of the World Court ends in 1967. As president of the World Court, communist Winarowski wields great power. For example, all hearings are under the control of the president. All minutes of the hearing must be signed by this communist president and a court register. A juggled word here and there, a few placed or misplaced commas or periods, since these court quote-unquote minutes set legal precedents, could play havoc with the laws of the United States and other non-communist countries. If the UN court deadlocks on a vote, its present communist president, Mr. Winarowski, will have 2 votes. In addition to his regular vote, he will have an extra vote called a casting vote in order to break the tie. The Atlantic Community. The Council on Foreign Relations Study states, promote the solidarity of the Atlantic Community. The name Atlantic Community, chosen apparently to connote a union of free Western nations, is a misnomer, because the Council on Foreign Relations Study also states, prevent Atlantic Community solidarity from becoming or seeming to become a front against non-Western nations. Supposedly, the internationalists would wish to include Japan and certain African nations in the Atlantic Community, which would account for the above recommendation. Tremendous efforts have gone into the establishment of the Atlantic Community, with its high-sounding name as a stepping stone for dragging the United States into a new international order, which means a socialist, one world government. It would seem, therefore, that the Atlantic Community is an integral part of this setup, and will therefore be maintained and implemented even though the name of the organization appears to be slightly restrictive. Another recommendation made by the Council on Foreign Relations Study number 7 is, U.S. economic aid programs must be more ambitious, longer term, and aimed at specific areas and tasks. Originally, the foreign aid program was sold to the American people under the pretext of preserving the free world against world communism. However, this phony line was exposed when it was revealed that during the period from July 1, 1945 to June 30, 1957, over $2.5 billion U.S. taxpayer dollars was sent to communist or communist-dominated countries such as Albania, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, the Soviet Union, and Yugoslavia. You see, ladies and gentlemen, the facade, the lie, the ruse, the deception that has been perpetuated on the American people for decades. My show, whether or not you want to call it dry or lively, is bringing you the truth that our government has aided and abetted the communist advance the communist success for many years. And again, I will say this in this broadcast if I have to say it in every broadcast. Quoting the current President Barack H. Obama, his words not mine, quote, "While in college, I actively sought out Marxist professors," unquote. And we shall continue with our discussion. Further, more than $300 million in U.S. foreign aid was used to defeat the anti-communist forces in Indonesia. Tito of Yugoslavia, who frequently pledges his loyalty to the Soviet Union, now has the 5th largest air force in the world, an air force that can be used against the free world, an air force that was financed by U.S. foreign aid. Now that the deception of foreign aid being used to fight communism has been exposed, the foreign aid promoters have switched to a new line, which is, according to the Council on Foreign Relations Study Number 7, to assist the less developed areas throughout the world. This new foreign policy switch strangely follows an instruction from the late Joseph Stalin, dictator of the Soviet Union, who stated in, quote, "Marxism and the national colonial question," unquote. It is essential that the advanced countries should render aid, real and prolonged aid, to the backward countries in their cultural and economic development. Otherwise, it would be impossible to bring about peaceful coexistence of the various nations and peoples within a single economic system, which is so essential for the triumph of socialism. And that's what they're doing, ladies and gentlemen. That is why George Bush, a Republican, proposed the GATT agreement and the NAFTA agreement. And that is why a Democrat named Bill Clinton signed both of them into law. It should be noted that when Stalin used the word socialism, he actually means communism, inasmuch as in communist jargon the words socialism and communism are interchangeable. Military foreign aid. In an attempt to lead the American people to think that their tax dollars are being used to arm friendly nations, the Council on Foreign Relations Study Number 7 recommends a long-range global military aid program to strengthen the U.S. and its allied defenses. And we had a page here, ladies and gentlemen, that apparently didn't load. So we are going to go down, and we'll continue here. The framers of the Constitution never envisioned that the day would come when men in high places would wish to negotiate away the rights and privileges of the people of the United States. It is obvious that in recommending such secret negotiations, the Council on Foreign Relations Study Number 7 recognized this constitutional loophole and plans to exploit it to the ultimate destruction of the U.S. Constitution itself. Disarmament, ladies and gentlemen. What have I talked about in many broadcasts? The Council on Foreign Relations Study Number 7 recommends that the U.S. A. fully explore Soviet proposals for complete or partial disarmament. B. Concentrate more on developing our own disarmament proposals. C. Negotiate on these proposals, perhaps directly with the USSR, in secret. D. Negotiate in the framework of the United Nations. And that is why, ladies and gentlemen, Hillary Clinton, now the former Secretary of State, proposed and promoted the UN Small Arms Treaty. You see, it's all documented in black and white, right in front of you. Documents that your parents and grandparents, and books that your grandparents and parents ignored. And I believe that there is a great awakening going on in our nation. With this information, we can continue to bring the truth to the people of America and the people of the world. Here indeed is proof positive that the Council on Foreign Relations proposes to conduct negotiations, quote, in secret, unquote, with the USSR. As for negotiating within the framework of the UN, which the CFR recommends, this would put all negotiations directly under the control of the Soviet Union, which now not only controls the United Nations, but also exercises veto power in the Security Council. Red record of broken treaties. Of what value would any disarmament treaty with the Soviet Union be when Khrushchev has stated that promises are like pie crusts, made to be broken? Regarding the Soviet Union's record of treaty breaking, Senate document number 85 in 1955, entitled Soviet Political Treaties and Violations, states, the staff of the Subcommittee on Internal Security studied nearly 1,000 treaties and agreements, both bilateral and multilateral, which the Soviets have entered into, not only with the United States, but with all countries all over the world. The staff found that in the 38 short years since the Soviet Union came into existence, its government had broken its word to virtually every country to which it ever gave a signed promise. And I believe, ladies and gentlemen, you should substitute the word Soviet with the word Russian, because no matter what government the Russian people have had in their history, they've always had designs on the rest of the world, and the American people, if they have any semblance of intelligence at all, should never trust the Russians, nor should they ever trust the Chinese. The Council on Foreign Relations is well aware of the Soviet record of treaty breaking. They know that in view of this record, the Soviet Union could not be expected to live up to any disarmament program, and yet the Council on Foreign Relations insists on promoting disarmament of the United States in the face of Soviet aggression, the latest example of which is the establishment of a Soviet satellite, Cuba, only 90 miles from America's shores. Excuse me, ladies and gentlemen. In his article in the May 1962 issue of Esquire, Richard H. Rovere states that the establishment, quote, is a coalition of forces, the leaders of which form the top directed or executive committee, referred to sometimes as Central. But the lower level organization is quite loose, almost primitive in some cases, unquote. Both the Dan Smoot report and Richard Rovere are agreed that the Council on Foreign Relations furnishes the top leadership for the establishment. One of the organizations is the, quote, coalition of forces, unquote, is the Center for the International Affairs at Harvard University. In the book previously mentioned entitled, quote, Strategy for the 1960s, unquote, with an introduction by Senator Fulbright, appears study number 10, which is based on a report by the Center for International Affairs at Harvard. Several noteworthy points which can be assumed to represent establishment thinking emerged from study number 10 by the Center for International Affairs at Harvard. The establishment's views on nationalism. Here is the definition of nationalism as contained in study number 10. Nationalism is the assertion by a people of its claim to a distinctive national identity, entitling it to live its own life in its own fashion. To the above statement, we have no disagreement. Study number 10, further discussing nationalism, then states, nationalism seldom yields positive doctrine beyond the demand for a sovereign state independent of alien overlords. The question immediately comes to mind, what more positive doctrine is needed than that of a sovereign state independent of alien overlords? And the study number 10 makes two interesting admissions. The Harvard study laments that nationalism, quote, tends to be anti in character, and goes on to say that, while based on mass support, it is not necessarily democratic. How these two puerile statements ever found their way into a supposedly learned Harvard study is hard to understand. Of course, nationalism is, quote, anti, unquote, anything and anybody who menaces the national sovereignty of its state. Of course, it is anti-alien overlords or alien dictators over its native land. And then that amazing contradiction that nationalism, through based on mass support, is not democratic. Comment would appear to be unnecessary. But the dichotomy continues, because two sections later the Harvard study admits, Nationalism does, however, have much to contribute to the development of new countries by A. providing a sense of social and political solidarity, and B. injecting dynamism and political activism into the society. In other words, the intellectual pundits of Harvard are perfectly willing to foster and permit nationalism among cannibals in Africa, but would deny and downgrade the spirit of nationalism among the citizens of the United States of America. Study number 10 of the Center for International Affairs of Harvard University states, "The West's primary interest is not in maintaining the status quo and supporting entrenched domestic interests which oppose necessary social change." Thus it would appear that Harvard experts feel no compunction in recommending programs and policies which would disastrously affect the domestic economy of the United States. The Kennedy administration's Trade Expansion Act of 1962, which admits that a number of U.S. industries will be grievously hurt by wiping out tariffs, is an example of the anti-U.S. industry attitude on the part of the internationalist experts. Quote, "The necessary social change," unquote, referred to in study number 10, is for the purpose of furthering, quote, "the psychological unification of the world," unquote. The Harvard study also states, "Internationalism today is a corrective for nation-states. It is a remedy against the dangers arising when states are left to their own devices, and a cure for the deficiencies states experience when isolated. When the United States of America was left to its own devices and operated with strict adherence to the spirit and law of the U.S. Constitution, the United States became the most powerful and most respected nation on earth. Today, after several decades of internationalist-oriented foreign policy and a squandering of over $100 billion in foreign aid overseas, the United States has a national debt higher than the combined national debts of all other nations in the world." And that was said 40 years ago, ladies and gentlemen. 40 years ago we had a national debt that was higher than all the other nations in the world. Further, the billions wasted overseas in foreign aid have not guaranteed that a single ally would stand by our side in the case of Soviet aggression. The United States flag is burned and spat upon in foreign capitals of the world. Americans overseas are assaulted or murdered with little or no protest from our government. The establishment, notably the Council on Foreign Relations, through effective infiltration by its members into the U.S. State Department, has played a key role into reducing the United States into its present situation, and that's the same situation that we're finding ourselves in today in the year 2013, ladies and gentlemen. The documentation contained in this chapter is based on the report entitled Tax-Exempt Foundations, the Special Committee to Investigate Tax-Exempt Foundations and Comparable Organizations, House of Representatives, 83rd Congress, which was submitted to the Committee of the Whole House on December 16, 1954. The abbreviated name for this investigating committee, which was headed by the late Congressman Carroll B. Reese of Tennessee, is the Reese Committee. As stated before, the top leadership and policy-making functions of the establishment are furnished by the Council on Foreign Relations. Who finances the Council on Foreign Relations? With what other organizations and foundations is the Council on Foreign Relations affiliated? What is the interlock? And what accounts for the socialist, internationalist bias of the interlock? The term foundation is a broad one. In the Reese Committee report, this term is used to denote foundations as it is ordinarily used by the layman, indicating such foundations as the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Ford Foundation, etc. In investigating these tax-free foundations, the Reese Committee decided to confine their inquiry chiefly to the activities of the foundations, which are known as the social sciences. The power of the individual large foundation is enormous. It can exercise various forms of patronage which carry with them elements of thought control. It can materially predetermine the development of social and political concepts with their resultant courses of action. This power to influence national policy is amplified tremendously when foundations act in concert. The far-reaching power of the large foundations and of the interlock, or working arrangements between them, has so influenced the press the radio, and even the government that it has become extremely difficult for objective criticism of Foundation practices to get into news channels without having first been distorted, slanted, discredited, and at times ridiculed. The hearings and report of the Reese Committee on tax-exempt foundations are now out of print, but I have them uploaded to www.worldtruth.org, ladies and gentlemen, and I have a copy in my home library entitled Foundations, Their Power and Influence, written by Renee Wormser, which has all this documentation contained therein. Because the documented testimony in the 1954 hearings have such an acute bearing on the foreign policy practices of the U.S. government today, considerable space in this chapter will be given to a restatement of the committee findings in order to bring this information to the widest number of present-day readers. House Resolution 217, adopted July 27, 1953, which created the Reese Committee, authorized an investigation to determine which foundations and organizations exempt from federal income taxation are using their resources for un-American and subversive activities, for political purposes, propaganda, or attempts to influence legislation. The Reese Committee report states, substantial evidence indicates that there is more than a mere close working together among some foundations operating in the international field. There is here a close interlock. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, the Rockefeller Foundation, and recently the Ford Foundation, joined by some others, have commonly cross-financed to the tune of many millions various intermediate and agency organizations concerned with internationalism, among them the Institute for Pacific Relations, the Foreign Policy Association, the Council on Foreign Relations, and others. That the interlock, happened by sheer coincidence stretches credulity. To such unity of purpose, effort, and direction resulted from chance or happenstance seems unlikely. Some of the larger foundations have had a significant impact upon our foreign policy and have done much to condition the thinking of our people among internationalist lines, which is the internationalism which meets with such hearty foundation support. Professor Kenneth Colgrove, in his testimony before the Reese Committee, stated, in my opinion, a great many of the staffs of the foundations have gone way beyond Wendell Willkie with reference to internationalism and globalism. And, ladies and gentlemen, how many times do you hear the term globalism in a week if you would watch the mainstream media, or the term internationalism or the international community if you watch the quote-unquote mainstream media for a week? I can guarantee you that it's mentioned time and time again every day, day in and day out, because they are trying to propagandize the American people into thinking in an internationalist and globalist way. That is why the economy is always now referred to as the global economy. The nations of the world are always referred to as the international community or the community of nations. They're trying to erase the concept of sovereignty, individualism, and nationalism in the minds of the American people and, of course, the people of the world, because the New World Order, ladies and gentlemen, obviously is global, and it can't work without the participation of other nations. Former Assistant Secretary of State Spiro Braden stated in a letter to the Counsel for the Reese Committee after he had testified before the Senate International Security Subcommittee, I have a very definite feeling that these various foundations very definitely do exercise both overt and covert influences on our foreign relations, and that their influences are counter to the fundamental principles on which this nation was founded and which made it great. The Rockefeller Foundation minced no words in its 1946 report. The challenge of the future is to make this world one world, a world truly free to engage in common and constructive intellectual efforts that will serve the welfare of mankind everywhere. And that is a lie, ladies and gentlemen. A socialist totalitarian government doesn't serve the welfare of mankind. It serves the welfare of the masters controlling it. In commenting on the above statement of the Rockefeller Foundation report, the Reese Committee report said, however, well-meaning the advocates of complete internationalism may be, they often play into the hands of the communists. Communists recognize that a breakdown of nationalism is a prerequisite to the introduction of communism. Preparation for world citizenship. During the years 1925 to 1952, the Rockefeller Foundation gave $11,069,770 to the American Council of Learned Societies. In 1947, President Harry Truman appointed the Commission on Higher Education. The President of the American Council on Learned Societies was chairman of this commission, which produced a report emphasizing that the domestic scene was to be changed by a concerted effort on the part of the intellectual leaders of this nation, so that the American people would be led toward world citizenship. This report of the President's Commission on Higher Education contained this statement: in speed of transportation and communication, and in economic interdependence, the nations of the globe are already one world. The task is to secure recognition and acceptance of this oneness in the thinking of the people, so that the concept of one world may be realized psychologically, socially, and in good time, politically. It is this task in particular that challenges the scholars and teachers to lead the way toward a new way of thinking. There is an urgent need for a program for world citizenship that can be made a part of every person's general education. Page 41 of the Reese Committee report states, it is a conclusion of this committee that the trustees of some of the major foundations have on numerous important occasions been beguiled by truly subversive influences, without many of their trustees having the remotest idea of what has happened. These foundations have frequently been put substantially to uses which have adversely affected the best interests of the United States. In discussing communist infiltration of the foundations, the Reese Committee report states, the Cox Committee, which preceded the Reese Committee, record shows that a conscious plan by the communists was inaugurated to infiltrate the foundations for the purpose of appropriating their funds to communist uses. We know from the evidence that the communists succeeded in the case of 7 foundations: the Marshall Field Foundation, the Garland Fund, the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, the Heckscher Foundation, the Robert Marshall Foundation, the Rosenwald Fund, and the Phelps Stokes Fund. And we are aware of the tragic result to our nation and to the world of communist infiltration into the Institute of Pacific Relations. We know also that then undisclosed communists and their fellow travelers have been able to secure grants from other foundations, including Carnegie and Rockefeller. We know further what the Cox Committee referred to as the ugly, unalterable fact that Alger Hiss became the president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. And as I said, ladies and gentlemen, Alger Hiss was a communist spy convicted as a communist spy, and was the author of the UN Charter and friend and close confidant to President Harry S. Truman, who was also author of State Department publication 3972, where he admits that he believes essentially in a one-world government which would excite the imagination of certain men, and that he believed in creating an internationalist world order. We do not know the full extent to which there has been penetration or use of foundations and their resources. It is too much to assume that communist success was limited to the exposed instances. Indeed, where foundations are involved in so high a concentration of power, we may assume that some advantage may have been taken by communists to use this interlock, directly or indirectly, for malign purposes. Whether the penetration is by outright communists or by some other variety of socialists or collectivists, The danger of its occurrence is far greater where there exists a complex of interrelated and interlocked organizations. There are more opportunities for shifting both personnel and grants. After they have poured these funds into the managerial hands of others, the detailed distribution is beyond their control. In 1952, the Senate Committee on the Judiciary stated, "The Institute of Pacific Relations was a vehicle used by the Communists to orient American Far Eastern policies toward Communist objectives. Members of the small core of officials and staff members who controlled IPR were either communist or pro-communist. It was the continued practice of the IPR to place in government positions both persons associated with the IPR and other persons selected by the effective leadership of the IPR. The result of IPR activities on United States public opinion has been such as to serve international communist interests and to affect adversely the interests of the United States." According to the McCarran Committee, the Rockefeller Foundation should have known as early as the 1930s that the Institute of Pacific Relations had ceased to be a proper or even safe recipient of foundation funds. And yet, as late as December 31st, 1952, the Rockefeller Foundation, with Dean Rust's approval, donated $50,000 to the IPR. Mr. Thomas McNeice, Assistant Research Director for the Reese Committee, described a central or mainstream of influence running from the foundations and their centralized agencies into government. There was considerable evidence to show that the government had come to rely upon the foundation clearinghouses for lists of men to assist the specialists in the social sciences. In this connection, the Reese Committee report stated, "The political slant of these individuals may seriously affect the character of government operations. We have seen many communists and fellow travelers recommended by foundation executives for government posts. In the case of the recommendations to the government made by the Institute of Pacific Relations and the American Council of Learned Societies for Experts to be used by our occupation forces in Germany and Japan, the lists were heavily salted with communists and their supporters." And now back to the Council on Foreign Relations. The power block of the establishment, which by 1962 had to all intents and purposes taken over the formulation and implementation of U.S. foreign policy, and they are still doing it today, ladies and gentlemen. According to the hearings on the Reese Committee, the Rockefeller Foundation and its associated foundation, the Laurel Spiegelman Fund, contributed $1,320,700 to the Council on Foreign Relations during the years 1927 through 1952. The Reese Committee report on page 177 states, "The Council on Foreign Relations came to be in essence an agency of the United States government, no doubt carrying out its internationalist bias with it. When World War II broke out, it offered its assistance to the Secretary of State. As a result, under the Council's Committee on Studies, the Rockefeller Foundation initiated and financed certain studies on security and armaments product problems, economic and financial problems, political problems, and territorial problems. These were actually known as the War and Peace Studies. Later, this project was actually taken over by the State Department itself, engaging the secretaries who had been serving with the Council on Foreign Relations groups. A fifth subject was added in 1942 through the Peace Aims Group. There was a precedent for this. The Carnegie Endowment offered its services to the government in both World War I and World War II. There was even an interlock in personnel in the person of Professor James T. Shotwell and many others, some of whom proceeded into executive and consultative office in the government. There can be no doubt that much of the thinking in the State Department came from the personnel of the Carnegie Endowment and the Council on Foreign Relations. The Carnegie Endowment, in its 1934 yearbook, proudly asserts that it is becoming an unofficial instrument of international policy, taking up here and there the ends and threads of international problems and questions which the government finds it difficult to handle, and through private initiative, reaching conclusions which are not of a formal nature, but which unofficially find their way into the policies of governments. That, ladies and gentlemen, is an admission of the usurpation of power by a private organization and the outright control of the proper power vested in the Congress of the United States. And those people that know the true aims and goals of the Council on Foreign Relations, who serve in the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate, and in the executive branch of government, are traitors. Congress cannot give its authority or take advice from unelected people. They certainly can listen. I wish to correct that statement. But when a private organization seeks to influence and subvert the proper powers and functions given to the Congress by the Constitution of the United States, there exists a tyranny and an evil that must be wiped out. The Constitution prescribes no such powers to private organizations. The report of Catherine Casey, legal analyst for the Reese Committee, clearly shows the interlock between the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and some of their associated organizations, such as the Council on Foreign Relations with the State Department. And then the Reese Committee report states, indeed, these foundations and organizations would not dream of denying this interlock. They proudly noted in reports they have A. undertaken vital research projects for the department, B. virtually created minor departments or groups within the department for it, C. supplied advisors and executives from their ranks, D. fed a constant stream of personnel into the State Department trained by themselves or under programs which they have financed, and E. have had much to do with the formulation of foreign policy both in principle and detail. They have, to a marked degree, acted as direct agents of the State Department, and they have engaged actively and with the expenditure of enormous sums in propagandizing, educating public opinion in support of the policies which they have helped to formulate. What this committee questions, however, is whether it is proper for the State Department to permit organizations to take over important parts of its research and policy-making functions when these organizations consistently maintain a biased, one-track point of view. What we see here is a number of large foundations, primarily the Rockefeller Foundation, the Carnegie Corporation of New York, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, using their enormous public funds to finance a one-sided approach to foreign policy, and to promote it actively among the public by propaganda and in the government through infiltration. In tracing the origin of the Council on Foreign Relations, the Dan Smoot report of June 12, 1961 states that it was incorporated in 1921 and then goes on to say, the Council did not amount to a great deal until 1927, when the Rockefeller family, through the various Rockefeller foundations and funds, began to pour money into it. Before long, the Carnegie Foundation and later Ford began to finance the Council. In 1929, the Council, largely with Rockefeller gifts, acquired its present headquarters property, the Harold Pratt House, 58 East 86th Street, New York City. George Pratt Schultz, ladies and gentlemen, Secretary of State under President Ronald Reagan, was a relative of Harold Pratt. In 1939, the Council began to take over the American State Department. The membership of the Council on Foreign Relations is restricted to 700 resident members, those whose residence or place of business is within 50 miles of City Hall, New York City, and 700 non-resident members who reside or do business outside that 50-mile radius. For the purpose of this book, no differentiation will be made regarding resident or non-resident members, inasmuch as the two different designations relate to geography and not to the influence or importance of the member. The Council on Foreign Relations, representing central of the liberal establishment, would not be able to exert the tremendous power it does over U.S. foreign policy and the federal government itself, did it not have the ability to pose as a responsible, respectable organization composed of famous and near-famous citizens. Members of the Council on Foreign Relations not only represent all religious faiths, Catholic, Protestant, and Jewish, but also the following fields: finance, government, business, labor, military, education, mass media, communications. In Chapter 1, quoting directly from study number 7 of the Council on Foreign Relations, it was seen that the CFR is presently promoting the following: 1. Building a new international order. 2. Maintaining and gradually increasing the authority of the communist-dominated United Nations. 3. Repealing the Connolly Amendment, which prevents the World Court from having jurisdiction over U.S. domestic matters. 4. Increasing and promoting longer-term foreign aid without making such aid contingent upon political commitments to the West. 5. Negotiating on disarmament proposals directly with the USSR in secret. It should be borne in mind, however, that these CFR recommendations were intended for the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee and not for the American public. In literature prepared for public consumption, innocuous-sounding statements of a calculated, non-controversial nature are employed. Consider this opening sentence from an official Council on Foreign Relations pamphlet entitled Studies on Foreign Policy 1959 to 1960. The central purpose of the Council on Foreign Relations is the study of important problems which confront the United States on the planning and conduct of its foreign policy in the complex world of today. The Council's program of studies represents a continuing effort to explore and clarify these problems through group discussions and scholarly research. Carefully cloaking its real purpose and attempting to add authenticity to both its existence and its recommendations, the Council on Foreign Relations has managed to corral a stable of big names, well known to the majority of the American people. For example, the annual report of the Council on Foreign Relations for 1960 lists among its members the following: Dean Acheson, former Secretary of State; Winthrop Aldrich, former head of Chase National Bank, presently a member of the Board of Directors, Rockefeller Center; Roger M. Blau, Chairman of the Board of U.S. Steel Corporation; Clifford P. Chase, U.S. Senator from New Jersey; Marquise Childs, syndicated columnist; Charles Collingwood, news commentator; James B. Conant, former president of Harvard University; Norman Cousins, editor-in-chief, Saturday Review of Literature; David Dubinsky, President, International Ladies Garment Workers Union; Dwight D. Eisenhower, former President of the United States. Everybody in America liked Ike, didn't they? My old Ike, sitting in the White House, was working to destroy the United States Constitution and the sovereignty of this nation. Douglas Fairbanks, movie actor. W. Averell Harriman, former governor of New York, Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs. Paul G. Hoffman, Managing Director, United Nations Special Fund. Hubert Humphrey, U.S. Senator from Minnesota, and later to become presidential candidate. Howard H. Lehman, former U.S. Senator from New York. Jacob Javits, U.S. Senator from New York. Walter Lippmann, syndicated columnist. Gail McGee, U.S. Senator from Wyoming. Stanley Marcus, President Neiman Marcus, Dallas, Texas. Edward R. Murrow, Director of the United States Information Agency. Edward R. Murrow is also a CBS anchor, ladies and gentlemen, which you are taught in history to admire, when in actuality Edward R. Murrow was nothing but a traitor to this nation. Reverend Reinhold Niebuhr, author and theologian, teacher at Union Theological Seminary. Ogden Reed, Chairman of the Board, New York Herald Tribune. David Rockefeller, Chairman, Chase International Investment Corporation. John D. Rockefeller III, Trustee, Rockefeller Brothers Fund, Director of Rockefeller Center. Nelson A. Rockefeller, Governor of New York State, and later Vice President, ladies and gentlemen, under Richard Nixon. Elmo B. Roper, Jr., Public Opinion Pollster. William L. Shire, author and news commentator. Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, chairman of the board, New York Times. Stuart Symington, U.S. Senator from Missouri. One of the greatest feats of the Council on Foreign Relations is that it has managed to weld patriotic, basically conservative professional and military leaders together with cited communist fronters into one organization. It can only be assumed that naive, non-liberal members of the Council on Foreign Relations are unaware of the subversive backgrounds of some of their fellow CFR members. In discussing the infiltration of the Council on Foreign Relations by communists and communist fronters, the Dan Smoot report of June 19, 1961 stated, by 1941, the Council on Foreign Relations and the various foundations and organizations interlocked with it had virtually taken over the American State Department and had controlling influence over the Roosevelt administration through powerful individuals strategically placed in many of the agencies. Some Council on Foreign Relations individuals were later identified as Soviet espionage agents. For example, Alger Hiss, Harry Dexter White, Lachlan Curry. Other Council on Foreign Relations members, Owen Lattimore for instance, with powerful influence in the Roosevelt and Truman administrations, were subsequently identified not as actual communists or Soviet espionage agents, but as conscious, articulate instruments of the Soviet international conspiracy. I do not intend to imply by these citations that the Council on Foreign Relations is or ever was a communist organization. The fact, however, that communist Soviet espionage agents and pro-communists could work inconspicuously for many years as influential members of the Council indicates something very significant about the Council's objectives. The ultimate aim of the Council on Foreign Relations, however well-intentioned, as prominent and powerful members may be, is the same as the ultimate aim of international communism, to create a one-world socialist system and make America part of it. It is noteworthy that Owen Lattimore, although termed in 1952 a conscious, articulate instrument of the Soviet international conspiracy, nevertheless is listed as a member of the Council on Foreign Relations in the CFR Annual Report of 1960. The 1960 Annual Report of the Council on Foreign Relations lists a total of 1,304 members. An investigation by the authors reveals that some of these members have wittingly or unwittingly engaged in activities which in one way or another have aided the communist cause. Each of the following persons is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations according to the 1960 CFR report, and each has, at one time or another, been associated in some way, according to congressional investigating committees, with two or more communist promoting activities, or activities sympathetic to the cause of communism. The names were especially selected because they are generally recognizable by the American public. Ralph Bunch, Clark M. Eichelberger, Sam A. Jaffe, Philip C. Jessup, Owen Lattimore, Reverend Reinhold Niebuhr, J. Robert Oppenheimer, Whitney North Seymour, Vincent Sheehan, Leland Stoll, Walter Wanger. The above list is by no means complete. For additional listings of CFR members, as well as a full explanation of questionable affiliations, including sources of documentation, see Appendix 2. The findings contained in Appendix 2 were limited to the government documents and public records at our disposal for this investigation. The listing of this page on or in Appendix 2 of the strange affiliations of some members of the Council on Foreign Relations is not intended to imply that such individuals at present hold the views which account for their being listed. On the other hand, public records indicating continuing participation in similar activities by some CFR members. And for all you people, ladies and gentlemen, who believe that President Kennedy was a benevolent leader, we will continue. Indicative of the ease with which the Council on Foreign Relations is able to place its members in high posts in government, regardless of which party is in power, is the fact that the following members of the Council on Foreign Relations were appointed by President Kennedy. And these are key positions, ladies and gentlemen. And remember, the aim of the Council on Foreign Relations is a world government. Secretary of State Dean Rusk, Secretary of Treasury Douglas Dillon, Secretary of Labor Arthur J. Goldberg, Chief of U.S. Disarmament Administration John J. McCloy, U.S. Representative to the United Nations Adlai E. Stevenson, Assistant Secretary of State for Far Eastern Affairs Averill Harriman, Undersecretary of State George W. Ball, Chief of Protocol Angier Biddle Duke, Undersecretary of the Treasury Henry H. Fowler, Deputy Secretary of Defense Roswell L. Gilpatrick, Assistant Secretary of Defense in charge of International Security Affairs Paul Nitz, Special Advisor to the President Chester Bowles, Deputy Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs Walt W. Rostow, Special Assistant to the President Arthur M. Schlesinger, Jr., Director of Central Intelligence Agency John A. McCone, Director of U.S. Information Agency Edward R. Murrow, Special Assistant to the President for National Security Affairs George Bundy, also a cousin of mass murderer Ted Bundy, ladies and gentlemen. Special Assistant to the President Jerome B. Wisner, Ambassador to Nationalist China Alan Goodrich Kirk, to head three-power nuclear disarmament negotiations in Geneva, March 21, 1961, Arthur H. Dean. The above names, with the exception of Arthur Goldberg, are all listed as members of the CFR according to its 1960 report. Mr. Goldberg became a CFR member in 1961. This list should not be considered complete, inasmuch as it can be assumed that other members of the Council on Foreign Relations occupy positions of lesser importance in the Kennedy administration. However, the above list gives a graphic picture of the overall control that the CFR has managed to exert over the functioning of the United States government itself. It will be noted that in the key areas of foreign policy, foreign aid, disarmament, defense, treasury, labor, intelligence, the CFR holds the reins of power because of the appointment of their members to the policy-making posts. Who are the other 96? As stated previously, the membership of the Council on Foreign Relations is restricted to 1,400. The 1960 annual report by the CFR, however, lists only 1,304 members. Question: who are the other 96 unlisted members? Former Vice President Richard M. Nixon, although not listed in the 1960 report, was invited to join the CFR in 1961. There is, however, conflicting evidence as to whether or not President Kennedy is presently a member of the CFR. In the case of Kennedy, whether he is a member of the Council on Foreign Relations is immaterial, inasmuch as his foreign policy mirrors that of the CFR. The 1960 CFR annual report does not list Senator J.W. Fulbright. Again, as in the case of Kennedy, Fulbright possibly renders more yeoman service to the CFR than do some of the listed members. Below are random comments regarding background or public statements of certain CFR members in the Kennedy administration, in order to give the reader an idea of the thinking of these individuals. Dean Rusk, Secretary of State. During the Korean War, Mr. Rusk is reported to have been in total agreement with President Truman that U.S. planes should not attack Red Chinese supply bases across the Yalu River. Further, Mr. Rusk is said to have been in accord with the handcuffing and removal of one of the greatest Americans of all times, General of the Army Douglas MacArthur, who desired to defeat the Red aggressors, insisting correctly that in war there is no substitute for victory. Also see Chapter 2, in which it is documented that Dean Rusk approved a Rockefeller Foundation contribution to the Institute of Pacific Relations after the IPR had been declared to be subversive. Edward R. Murrow, Director of U.S. Information Agency. According to syndicated columnist Fulton Lewis, Jr., Edward R. Murrow went all out to whitewash Dr. J. Robert Oppenheimer, who was denied security clearance by the government after he admitted he had contributed financially to communist causes, and that both his brothers and wife were deeply involved in communist associations. Murrow's record goes on and on. In his time he defended such persons as Harry Dexter White, who was identified as a Soviet agent. In 1935, the Soviet-Russian government itself disclosed that Murrow was an active supporter of the Moscow State University summer session of 1935. The Soviet aim at the time was to lure American teachers to this Moscow summer school and to indoctrinate them into communism. However, the Hearst papers on February 18, 1935 exposed this communist propaganda project, resulting in its abandonment. August Heckscher and Pendleton Herring, two Council on Foreign Relations members, wrote large segments of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund report in 1960. They are August Heckscher, director of the 20th Century Fund, and Pendleton Herring, president of the Social Science Research Council. According to syndicated columnist Alice Widener, the report contains denunciation of the excesses in our nation's various loyalty programs and actually asserts that the government's employment requirement that individuals prove their loyalty is a violation of basic democratic principles. This super egghead Rockefeller Brothers Fund report states that the American Communist Party is too insignificant to be a present danger. This is in flat contradiction to the considered and informed judgment of Director J. Edgar Hoover of the FBI. Max F. Millikan and Walt W. Rostow. In 1957, Max F. Millikan and Walt W. Rostow, both members of the Council on Foreign Relations, wrote a book entitled A Proposal, Key to an Effective Foreign Policy. In editorializing on the book, the New York Daily News states, Mr. Millikan and Rostow are a pair of economics professors at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Their proposal is what you might call a plan for a watered-down SunFed. SunFed is the proposed special United Nations funds for economic development, to be managed mainly by socialists and communists from both sides of the Iron Curtain, and to deal out billions of dollars in helping underdeveloped countries. We warned in the book that we must attach no strings to these loans or grants. We must give up any expectation of gratitude to begin with. There must be no objections voiced to loaning or giving money to socialist, semi-socialist, or fascist countries. We're even, according to Millikan and Rostow, to invite the Red Slave Empire to take part in the plan, Soviet Russia by putting up capital, and backward countries like Red China by accepting some of the loans or grants. And that's exactly what they did, ladies and gentlemen. They used your tax money and my tax money and our grandparents' and our parents' tax money to create the giant, mighty economic machine in Red China, who are rapidly modernizing their armed forces, building nuclear weapons, submarines, tanks, planes, stealth bombers, where we have a president of the United States that calls for disarmament, ladies and gentlemen. And the reason why he's calling for disarmament is so the communists of the world can bring this nation to its knees. Walter Millis, staff director for the Ford Foundation for the Republic Center for the Study of Democratic Institutions, wrote a book in 1961 entitled A World Without War. In that book, Walter Millis, a member of the Council on Foreign Relations, declares, many of the anti-communist measures taken in the name of internal security during the McCarthy era were really in the nature of tribal rights. Commenting on the above, the syndicated columnist Alice Widener stated, heavens above, our internal security measures, all passed by Congress, aren't tribal rights for us savages. They are our legitimate means of protection against a savage overthrow of our republic by force and violence. George Kennan. In 1961, President Kennedy appointed George Kennan a U.S. ambassador to Yugoslavia. Mr. Kennan, who served as ambassador to the Soviet Union 1952 to 1953, is also a CFR member. An idea of the thinking of Ambassador Kennan is given in the following statement he made before the Women's National Democratic Club in Washington only about a year before the Kennedy election, where he concluded that, if you ask me whether such a country, the United States, has over the long run good chances of competing with a purposeful, serious, and disciplined society such as that of the Soviet Union, I must say the answer is no. And our presidents of the United States, ladies and gentlemen, by coincidence, appoint all of these people to key places in our government. In an article in the Atlantic Monthly, George Kennan advocated defending our homes only as well as we can in the direct sense, but not by warning of retaliation if our homes should be destroyed. And then Mr. Kennan concluded by stating in the Atlantic Monthly article, it will be said to me, this means defeat. To this I can only reply, I am skeptical of the meaning of victory and defeat in relation to modern war between great countries. The CFR would not have achieved the pinnacle of power it now enjoys, and the increasing incorporation of its liberal communist appeasing recommendations into official U.S. foreign policy had it not been for the fact that the CFR has been able to infiltrate the mass communications media of this nation. It is a strange quirk of human nature that if something appears in print, is heard on the radio, or is seen on television, it becomes ipso facto not only authentic, but readily credible to unthinking citizens. Capitalizing on this mental laziness, this failure to question or do one's own thinking, the big guns of the CFR manipulated communications media spout forth their propaganda barrage in support of the aims of the CFR. An indication of the extent of saturation in the field of communications is the following list of CFR members, according to the 1960 report by the Council. After each name is listed, the position occupied in 1962 by these CFR members. Bearing in mind the tremendous circulation of the publications represented and the audience reaches by radio and TV networks, which number in the millions, the total impact of CFR propaganda can be easily understood. Joseph Barnes, editor, Simon & Schuster Incorporated, publishers. Marquise Childs, syndicated columnist. Gardner Coles of Coles Magazine Company, which controls Look Magazine, the Minneapolis Star and Tribune, and the Des Moines Register and Tribune. Mark Etheridge, publisher and vice president, Louisville Courier-Journal. Philip Graham, chairman of the board, Newsweek, publisher and president, Washington Post and Times-Herald. Alan Grover, vice president, Time Incorporated Publishers. Joseph C. Harsh, European correspondent, National Broadcasting Company, NBC. Palmer Hoyt, publisher, Denver Post. Sam A. Jaffe, CBS News. Walter Lippmann, syndicated columnist. Henry R. Luce, editor-in-chief, Time Magazine, Life Magazine. Malcolm Muir, chairman, executive committee, Newsweek, chairman of the board and editor-in-chief, McGraw-Hill Publishing Company. McGraw-Hill Publishing Company, ladies and gentlemen, is a big publisher of our nation's textbooks that teach your children. William S. Paley, chairman and director, Columbia Broadcasting System, CBS. James Reston, editorial writer, New York Times. Elmore Roper, public opinion pollster. David Sarnoff, director, NBC and Radio Corporation of America. William L. Shire, author and news commentator. Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, publisher and chairman of the board, New York Times. John Hay Whitney, president and publisher, New York Herald Tribune. In summary, it is seen that the Council on Foreign Relations is able to exert partial or maximum control of the editorial policy of the following principal organs of communication in this country: Columbia Broadcasting System, National Broadcasting System, Time Magazine, Life Magazine, Look Magazine, Newsweek Magazine, the New York Times, and New York Herald Tribune, plus syndicated columnists controlled by the latter two newspapers. And when occasionally a situation arises where the news commentators of NBC and CBS and the CFR captive newspapers and weekly magazines fall to drum up enough public support for CFR recommended legislation, CFR member Elmo Roper can always be counted on to take a poll and come up with his findings that the American people, quote, support, unquote, the proposed legislation. Just as, ladies and gentlemen, these same people running the media today come up with these quote unquote polls where the American people in a vast majority quote unquote support gun control. Which legislation has resulted from CFR recommendations to the government? What is Arden House? Another activity of the CFR is that of brainwashing businessmen. This is done under the auspices of an affiliation of the CFR known as the American Assembly. In the spring of 1962, the 21st American Assembly was held at Arden House, according to an article by Sylvia Porter, syndicated financial columnist. The executive director of the American Assembly is Henry M. Riston, who is president of the Council on Foreign Relations. Arden House, a 50-room French Renaissance-style mansion located at Harriman, New York, was donated in 1951 to Columbia University by CFR member W. Averill Harriman. with its luxurious interior furnishings and its elaborate gardens and surrounding park. Arden House is calculated to impress even its wealthiest visitors. Arden House is the scene of carefully planned 6-week seminars for businessmen. At these seminars, businessmen are briefed on the inner workings of government by so-called experts, particularly in the area of foreign policy. Impressed by the physical trappings at Arden House, the erudition of the lecturing experts, and flattered at having been selected to be a part of such august company, the businessmen are highly susceptible to the internationalist theories propounded at these seminars. For example, one lecturer billed as an authority on the real conditions inside Russia will give an unchallenged report on market conditions expected within the next 5 years, provided the U.S. will, quote, wake up, unquote, and do business with the Soviet Union and Red China. Another lecturer will moralize on the inevitability of Red China's admission into the UN and the necessity for U.S. cooperation to this end. Or the subject may be the necessity for placing foreign aid on a permanent basis under the control of the United Nations. Because open debate is frowned upon and because of the highly touted authority of the experts in their particular fields, the lectures are accepted and dogmatic truth by the businessmen, quote, students, unquote, at these American Assembly seminars. Alumni of Arden House form the nucleus of businessmen's groups who, under the skillful manipulation of policymakers in the Council on Foreign Relations, draw up resolutions and recommendations concerning governmental policy. In this way, by playing on the vanity of these businessmen, the master planners of the CFR associated with the American Assembly are able to use the gullible U.S. businessmen for their own purposes. The Council on Foreign Relations each year also holds a series of meetings of business executives. It is interesting to note whom their speakers have been in the past. Among these addressing the CFR meetings in recent years have been Anastas I. Mayokin, first Deputy Premier of the Soviet Union, Tom Mboya of Kenya, a follower of Jomo Kenyatta, leader of the murderous Mau Mau, and Fidel Castro, communist dictator of Cuba. According to the annual report of the Council on Foreign Relations 1960, the seminar theme in the fall of 1959 was the Soviet-America balance, trends and prospects. Then, according to the Council's report, at the final meetings, Robert R. Bowie, director of Harvard University's Center for International Relations and formerly Assistant Secretary of State for Policy Planning, evaluated the prospects for meaningful negotiations between the Communist bloc and the West. The theme chosen for the spring 1961 series of meetings was Problems of United States Foreign Economic Policy, at which United States relations with the European Common Market were discussed. This is a clear indication of the amount of pressure that the Council on Foreign Relations intends to put behind the move to make the United States a member of the European Common Market. It is perhaps noteworthy that Governor Nelson Rockefeller was a speaker at the May 1924-1960 dinner meeting of the Council on Foreign Relations. Because of the emphasis the CFR places on negotiation and trade with Communist Russia, it is apparent that there are a large number of highly influential U.S. businessmen who are incapable of learning from experience. Just as prior to World War II, certain businessmen and financial institutions believed that they could do business with Hitler, and saw nothing wrong in exporting scrap iron to Japan, which was later imported as shrapnel in the bodies of American soldiers. So the present-day internationalists, in their dangerous conceit, think that they can do business with representatives of the Soviet Union. The U.S. Senate Committee on the Judiciary, however, disagrees. In a study entitled The Technique of Soviet Propaganda, this Senate committee states, every form of exchange between communist and other countries, whether diplomatic, cultural, commercial, technical, or athletic, is conceived and worked out with propaganda in mind. The notion prevalent in the West that contacts with them may widen their horizons and humanize their views is absurd, for these are not men who can give free rein to their inclinations, but docile tools of the apparatus. In commenting on the above quotation from President Washington's farewell address to the people of the United States on September 17, 1796, The Dan Smoot report of June 19, 1961 states that Washington established a foreign policy which became traditional and a main article of faith for the American people in their dealings with the rest of the world. Mr. Smoot then continued, Washington warned against foreign influence in the shaping of national affairs. He urged America to avoid permanent entangling alliances with other nations, recommending a national policy of benign neutrality toward the rest of the world. Washington did not want America to build a wall around herself or to become in any sense a hermit nation. Washington's policy permitted freer exchange of travel, commerce, ideas, and culture between Americans and other people than Americans have ever enjoyed since the policy was abandoned. The father of our country wanted the American government to be kept out of the wars and revolutions and political affairs of other nations. In short, Washington told Americans that their nation had a high destiny, which could not fulfill if they permitted their government to be entangled in the affairs of other nations. This book is not intended to be a chronological history of foreign alliances into which the United States has entered contrary to the advice of George Washington. Rather, we are concerned with the steps taken in the past decade toward the destruction of U.S. national sovereignty in order to bring about a socialist, one-world government, which steps have been spearheaded and masterminded by members of the Council on Foreign Relations. We do not propose to discuss in detail the United Nations, where the United States, because of the admission of newly created African nations, is now outvoted by the communist bloc. The UN has not only failed to maintain peace, but has now become a smokescreen for Soviet aggression throughout the world. And we will, ladies and gentlemen, substitute the word Soviet for Russian. And the same thing is happening today, ladies and gentlemen, with the Russians protecting the communists in Syria. Also, the UN itself became the aggressor in the UN war against the independent nation of Katanga, as I mentioned in last week's broadcast, in the Congo. Instead, let us turn our attention to NATO, an international organization about which a majority of the American people have been deliberately misinformed or are dangerously uninformed regarding its true purpose. The North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Propaganda put out by promoters of NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, spreads the two following misconceptions. The attempt to give the impression that although the communists may dominate the United Nations, NATO is a separate organization having no connection with the UN, and two, they claim that NATO is a military alliance of the free world, the purpose of which is to defend the free world against Soviet aggression. Before refuting the above two claims by the NATO propagandists, here is some brief background on the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. The North Atlantic Treaty setting up NATO was signed in Washington, D.C. on April 4, 1949 by the United States, Canada, and 10 nations of Western Europe: Belgium, Denmark, France, Iceland, Italy, Luxembourg, the Netherlands, Norway, Portugal, and the United Kingdom. Greece and Turkey became members in February 1952, and the Federal Republic of Germany joined in May 1955, thus making a total of 15 nations as of 1962. Paris is the headquarters for NATO. The North Atlantic Treaty itself mentioned only one permanent organ, a council, the North Atlantic Council, and its powers were unspecified. By purposely not specifying the powers of the North Atlantic Council, ratification of the North Atlantic Treaty by the U.S. Senate was facilitated. Had specific powers been delineated for the North Atlantic Council, sufficient suspicion might have been aroused to have prevented ratification. The NATO Handbook, published in 1961, gives its first chapter a reason for the establishment of NATO as follows. In view of the strength of the Soviet Union, the balance could only be restored in favor of the West by an alliance of the free countries of Europe with the two North American powers, the United States and Canada. The Atlantic Congress, held in London June the 5th through the 10th, 1959, was attended by 650 citizens from every NATO country except Iceland. A report adopted by the Atlantic Congress at the plenary session on June 9th states, If we are to survive, we are faced by the necessity of opposing the communist world. Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty states, "The parties agree that an armed attack against one or more of them in Europe or America shall be considered an attack against them all, and consequently they agree that if such an armed attack occurs, each of them will assist the party or parties so attacked by taking such actions as it deems necessary, including the use of armed force." The above examples of the so-called anti-communist purpose of NATO are what is fed to the American public via the communications media controlled by the Council on Foreign Relations. Below is what the American public is not told. Article 51 of the United Nations Charter seemingly permits entangling alliances. Member nations to defend themselves against aggression by stating, "Nothing in the present charter shall impair the inherent right of individual or collective self-defense if an armed attack occurs against a member of the organization." But the UN Charter very carefully qualifies this permission to member nations to defend themselves against aggression by then stipulating in Article 51 that an attacked nation may defend itself until the Security Council has taken the measures necessary to maintain international peace and security. In Article 51, the United Nations Charter further exercises its control over the national ability of any individual member nation. Measures taken by members in the exercise of this right of self-defense shall be immediately reported to the Security Council. Article 53 of the UN Charter permits member nations to form regional arrangements, presumably for defense. But again, the UN qualifies how much defense action may be taken because Article 53 of the UN Charter says, "No enforcement action shall be taken under regional arrangements or by the national agencies without the authorization of the Security Council." Article 54 of the UN Charter then stipulates the conditions under which such regional arrangements may operate. The Security Council should at all times be fully informed of the activities undertaken or in contemplation under regional arrangements or by regional agencies for the maintenance of international peace and security. And what is this Security Council which is given the power in the UN Charter to decide whether or not a nation can defend itself against aggression? What is this Security Council to which all regional arrangements such as NATO must report concerning their activities? The Security Council is the United Nations Security Council. Its members include the United States, Great Britain, France, Nationalist China, and Communist Russia. Here then is the absurd situation where a NATO nation attacked by Communist Russia or its satellites would under the UN Charter be denied the right of self-defense from Soviet aggression unless the Soviet member of the UN Security Council gave his permission for a NATO counteroffensive against the Soviet aggressor. In other words, a simple veto by the Soviet member of the UN Security Council could deny a NATO nation the right of self-defense. Even though the internationalists promote NATO as a shield against communist aggression, those who drew up and signed the North Atlantic Treaty which established NATO did not actively intend NATO to be an effective counterforce to Soviet aggression, because the preamble of the North Atlantic Treaty reads, "The parties to this treaty reaffirm their faith in the purposes and principles of the Charter of the United Nations." Article 5 of the North Atlantic Treaty, in discussing action to be taken by members in the event of attack, states, "Any such armed attack and all measures taken as a result thereof shall immediately be reported to the UN Security Council." In other words, the framers of the NATO Treaty recognize that NATO is a mere creature of the communist-dominated United Nations. Article 7 of the NATO Treaty states, "This treaty does not affect the obligations under the Charter of the parties, which are members of the United Nations, or the primary responsibility of the Security Council for the maintenance of international peace and security." Again, it is seen that although NATO purports to have been established in order to defend the free world, it is admitted in the NATO Treaty that NATO is subservient to the Security Council of the United Nations, and that the UN Security Council has the primary responsibility for maintaining peace. And who composes the staff of this Security Council to whom NATO must report? A list furnished by the U.S. mission to the UN proves that the Assistant Secretary for Security Council Affairs since April 1949 to the present time has always been a communist, ladies and gentlemen. A communist has commanded NATO. A communist killed your parents or your grandparents in the Korean War. A communist killed your uncles, your brothers, your grandparents, or your parents in the Vietnam War. That is why America has not won a total victory in any international conflict since the days of World War I, ladies and gentlemen. If you believe America won World War II, you are sadly mistaken. World War II was won by the Soviet Union. Below are the names and terms of the office of these communists holding a key position on the UN Security Council, which in essence holds the reins of control and power over any action taken by NATO. Arkady A. Sobolev, April 1949 to April 28, 1949, resigned. Assistant Secretary for Security Council Affairs. Konstantin E. Zinchenko, April 1949 to May 1953. Ilyas Chernychev, June 30, 1953 to January 1955. Dragoslav Protich, January 1955 to June 1958. Anatoly F. Dobrinin, July 1, 1958 to May 1960. Anatoly Dobrinin was also the equivalent of the Secretary of State in the Soviet Union for many years. George P. Arkadev, May 1960, excuse me. Another illustration of the hypocrisy of NATO is that while pretending to be anti-communist, NATO members are actually engaging in a very lucrative trade with the Soviet Union and its satellites. A Special House Investigating Committee headed by Representative Paul Kitchen in a probe initiated in 1961 states, since January 1960 and through June 1961, massive procurements of plants and equipment embodying new Western technology have been made by the Soviet bloc. For example, the Kitchen report reveals that Great Britain has shipped the following types of potential war material behind the Iron Curtain: electrical equipment for jet aircraft, 100 all-purpose digital computers used in automation and telemetering of missiles, complete hydropower station, 2 mass spectrometers for use in nuclear and electronic research, precision missile instruments, etc. The Kitchen report also goes on to state how West Germany, Italy, Greece, and the Netherlands, all members of NATO, have exported the following strategic materials behind the Iron Curtain: diesel engines, control instruments for chemical plants, 3 40,000-ton tankers, 6,000 horsepower air conditioning systems for Russian missile plants. The syndicated columnist Fulton Lewis Jr. on June 5, 1962, stated that communist dictator Tito of Yugoslavia will travel to Moscow in the summer of 1962 in a visit that will, in the words of the New York Times, mark his rehabilitation as a formally recognized leader in the communist world. Mr. Lewis then points on that total U.S. foreign aid to communist Tito has now passed the $2.3 billion mark, with the figures rising. NATO, Paper Tiger. Major General C. A. Willoughby, in the October 28, 1960 issue of his Foreign Intelligence Digest, discussed views expressed by NATO Chief General Lawrence Norstad before the Appropriations Committee on the Strategy of NATO Forces. Stated General Willoughby, Norstad blandly presented the astounding thesis that NATO forces and the $50 billion of foreign aid it has consumed since 1945 are not there to win a war, but to, 1, give the enemy pause while SAC, the Strategic Air Command, retaliates, or 2, interrupt the continuity of enemy action when launched, and 3, force the enemy to reconsider a decision for total war. Amplifying on the false front of defense that NATO presents, Senator Russell Long of Louisiana stated in addressing the Young Men's Business Club of New Orleans, December the 15th, 1960, "Many of you here probably do not realize that none of the NATO North Atlantic Treaty Organization countries are obligated to go to war if Russia should attack the United States. Actually, they are obligated in the Charter only to consult and take necessary steps as they see fit. It would be no surprise if any of these countries were to negotiate with Russia over conference tables while she was actually engaged in warfare with us. Ladies and gentlemen, take a look at the symbol of NATO. It's a carefully conceived swastika. Symbols mean things. NATO is but another arm of the New World Order. Good night, and we'll see you again.